Welcome. Ooh. I am Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, and it's just my great pleasure to introduce our W.B. Du Bois lecturer today. Eddie S. Glaude Jr. is the William S. Todd Professor of Religion and African American Studies at Princeton University. He is currently the chair of the Center for African American Studies at Princeton, and he's also a senior fellow of the Jamestown Project at Harvard. He has published several books, the award-winning Exodus, Religion, Race, and Nation in Early 19th Century Black America. And this was published in 2000. He also he's author of the first, he edited Is It Nation Time? Contemporary Essays on Black Power and Black Nationalism in 2002. He also edited in 2002 with Cornell West, African American Religious Studies and Anthology. And he is the author of the book In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America, 2007. Eddie Glaude is one of the brightest and most insightful public intellectuals of his generation. Glaude is a regular commentator on Tavis Smiley. He has been a guest on radio shows ranging from The Brian Lehrer Show to Mildred Gaddis's Inside Detroit. He has also appeared on Hannity and Combs. Born on the coast of Mississippi in a small town called Moss Point, Glaude has never forgotten the long memory of the African American freedom struggle. And he has also never abandoned his prophetic voice for the need for the continued struggle for freedom and equality. He calls attention to the profound challenges that we face as a nation and also as a people. In his controversial article, The Black Church is Dead, Glaude writes, Black America stands at the precipice. African American unemployment is at its highest in 25 years. 35% of our children live in poor families. Inadequate health care, rampant incarceration, home foreclosures, and a general sense of helplessness overwhelm many of our fellows. Of course, countless local Black churches around the country are working diligently to address these problems. The question becomes, what will be the role of prophetic Black churches on the national stage under these conditions? I think that is the question of our hour. I was first introduced to Eddie Glaude at Princeton University in the early 1990s. I was a visiting professor in the Department of Religion there, and Eddie was considering the Princeton department for his PhD work. So while I was first introduced to you, I am just honored to be able to introduce you to our audience today as a renowned scholar of religion, as a man who has made such a difference in the academy and in the larger society, as one who is our Du Bois lecturer today and will give a series of lectures, Pragmatic Reconstruction, the Prophetic, the Heroic, and the Democratic. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. I remember we were up on that hill back in the old department as they were refurbishing 1879 Hall. And I remember sitting down talking with you about that groundbreaking article you had just written on race. Yeah, and as a meta language. And it's kind of humbling to be here in this particular place at this hour, in this moment with you, given that journey. I want to thank Professor Gates. I remember, I don't know if you remember this, Skip, but you said, I walked into your office one time, I don't know if it was in when we were over, look at me, wait, CVS? Yeah. And you said, oh, you the brother with the kente draws. Yeah. Right. Referencing my Asante days, as it were. But to think back on those early encounters and to think about this moment here, I'm really grateful to the committee for giving me this opportunity, to all my friends and colleagues who have come to share in hopefully something that is substantive and significant. I want to thank you. So with that, can I just jump into this? Because I wrote a book. So the first lecture is on prophecy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And the arc of the lectures is basically this. It's a leveling project. I want to think about the prophetic and the heroic in democratic terms, because there's a suspicion that I have that the way in which these two terms work, the way in which the prophet and the hero work in African American politics actually deforms African American politics. And I want to engage in a reconstructive project to think about how we might conceive of these differently. I'm really nervous now because I just saw Bob Moses over there. And he's spending the year with us at Princeton, and I've been blessed with our conversations over the last few months. So with that, let me get going. At the heart of John Dewey's philosophy lies a romantic impulse, a vision in which the moral imagination plays a crucial role in our efforts to become who we hope to be as we engage a perilous world. Now, my view of romanticism is much like that of Richard Rorty, that romanticism itself is, quote, the thesis of the priority of imagination over reason, the claim that reason can only follow paths that the imagination has broken, end quote. Now, of course, Dewey was dissatisfied with the way philosophers characterize reason. Reason is no special faculty set apart from desire and passion. Instead, Dewey preferred talk of intelligence and intelligent action, that which results from, quote, a cluster of habits and dispositions that include attentiveness to details, imagination, and passionate commitment, end quote. In Democracy and Education, for example, he wrote, quote, imagination is as much a normal and integral part of human activity as is muscular movement, end quote. We see its role in his 1932 Ethics as the inferential dimension of inquiry, where he holds off Kant's worry about the self-indulgent implications of the imagination. The imagination is more than a playground for Epicurean delight. It enables us to reach for the fullness of the complexity of human endeavor. It is that which makes possible a measure of distance from the cultural frames that box us in order to transform situations and to create ourselves anew. Now, for the purposes of this first lecture, I want to push a bit further Dewey's view of the imagination. That is, I want to think about how the prophetic and the moral imagination work as a dimension of critical intelligence, as a decision of conduct directed towards an as yet realized present, under conditions where matters of justice are at stake. Here my aim is rather ambitious. First, I want to recast the prophetic in light of my reading or peculiar reading of pragmatism. This will involve a close reading of Dewey and his understanding of the moral imagination. Throughout, I suggest, and I'm well aware that this is a strong reading, Harold Bloom actually haunts the lectures over all three, that the moral imagination within the exercise of critical intelligence functions much like prophecy in its romantic register. Now, all of this is to lay the groundwork for some preliminary reflections on how we might reconstruct the notion of the prophetic and the heroic in African American democratic life. This effort assumes a deep-seated suspicion about the democratic character of the prophetic tradition in African American politics. Here I'm gesturing towards lectures 2 and 3, and involves an idiosyncratic reading of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a romantic prophet. The underlying purpose here is to reconceive what freedom struggles can be and what they can do, and who ought to be their principal agents. Now, what occasioned these reflections was an odd encounter in Dewey's corpus. I was rereading Individualism Old and New and was struck by its current relevance, a trenchant critique of an inherited conception of individualism that denies the capacities of human beings to engage in intelligent action animates the book. Now, this denial deepens individual conformity to unjust arrangements as Americans then as now stand by silently in the face of deepening wealth inequality and widening social misery. As Dewey would later argue in his 1936 address at the Harvard Tercentenary Conference of the Arts and Sciences, this conception of individualism, quote, in the very act of asserting that it stood completely and loyally for the principle of individual freedom, was really engaged in justifying the activities of a new form of concentrated power, the economic, a new form, to state the matter moderately, which has consistently and persistently denied effective freedom to the economically underpowered and underprivileged, end quote. So here Dewey anticipates, in my view, one of the central features of neoliberalism, what Wendy Brown aptly describes as its political rationality. Now, on her view, neoliberalism isn't simply, quote, a set of economic policies. It's not only about facilitating free trade, maximizing corporate profits, and challenging welfarism. Rather, neoliberalism also instantiates a particular form of governmentality that extends the logics of the market into the very conception of who we take ourselves to be. As Brown writes, quote, neoliberalism normatively constructs and interpolates individuals as rational, calculating creatures whose moral autonomy is measured by their capacity for self-care, the ability to provide for their own needs and service their own ambitions. She goes on to say that, quote, a fully realized neoliberal citizenry would be the opposite of public-minded. Indeed, it would barely exist as a public. The body politic ceases to be a body, but is rather a group of individual entrepreneurs and consumers, end quote. Now, Dewey appeared to be tracking this development, in my view, in its earliest phases, and argued that what was needed in response to these conditions was a reconstructed notion of individuality consonant with the moment, where ideas and ideals are brought into harmony with the realities of the age in which they act, as he wrote. Reconstruction here characterizes an intellectual procedure that involves, among other things, refurbishing ready-at-hand terms that have lost their luster because of the changing conditions informing their use. What we mean by a word or phrase, for example, race or the color line at the dawn of the 20th century, might not register the same meanings in the second decade of the 21st century. And failure to attend to those differences may result in rampant confusion and misdiagnoses. Yet lackluster terms still influence how we see, describe, and understand our experiences. So Reconstruction amounts to a strong reading of the currency of particular words in light of problems faced with intelligence, an effort to establish an original relation to their use by exposing, say, a bad question at the heart, and to open their meanings to doings and sufferings currently in view by revealing historical nerve endings that overdetermine the present. As Dewey writes, Reconstruction can be nothing less than the work of developing, of forming, of producing the intellectual instrumentalities which will progressively direct inquiry into the deeply and inclusively human, that is to say, moral facts of the present scene and situation, end quote. In this instance of liberalism's failure and neoliberalism's ascent, what is required is a more adequate view of individuality in light of market forces that seek to contain democratic energies. Y'all all right? Just want to check on you. That's that Baptist in me, by way of Catholicism and Morehouse. This reconstructed view of individualism would be decidedly social and seen as developing within and through interactions with our fellows and by means of enabling social structures. In the interim, forces would continue to unhinge the old individualism, Dewey argued. Now listen to this quotation. Instances of the flux in which individuals are loosed from the ties that once gave order and support to their lives are glaring. They are indeed so glaring that they blind our eyes to the causes which produce them. Individuals are groping their way through situations which they do not direct and which do not give them direction. The beliefs and ideals that are uppermost in their consciousness are not relevant to the society in which they outwardly act and which constantly reacts upon them. Their conscious ideas are standards, and standards are inherited from an age that has passed away. Their minds, as far as consciously entertained principles and methods of interpretation are concerned, are at odds with actual conditions. This profound split is the cause of distraction and bewilderment, end quote. Now, Dewey, as usual, does not specify definitively the nature of the emergent individuality. He does not see, quote, how it can be described until more progress has been made in its production, end quote. Instead, he urges us to redirect our energies and to redeploy our imaginations in the service of creating a context in which individuality could in fact flourish. Now, near the end of chapter 4 of Individualism, Old and New, Dewey writes this sentence. This is the source of the lecture. There is a prophetic aspect to all observation. We can perceive the meaning of what exists only as we forecast the consequences it entails, end quote. Now, the context of this formulation is a reference to intelligence. Quote, because acknowledgement in thought brings with it intelligent discrimination and choice, it is the first step out of confusion, the first step in forming those objects of significant allegiance out of which stable and efficacious individuality may grow, end quote. Intelligence involves, of course, directed operations aimed at the modification of conditions. Its exercise includes, quote, all the guidance that is given by means of ideas, both direct and symbolic, end quote. So here we can see, in my view, the pathway to a reconstructed notion of prophecy, one shorn of its selectivity, where only some get to speak prophetically, and of its absolute authority, that is, as the word of God or some such power. Instead, the prophetic, in the very exercise of critical intelligence and the central place of the moral imagination in it, takes on a more democratic function in the lives of everyday ordinary people. No more waiting for rainbow signs. Our imaginations, the source of the rainbow in the first place, now suggest the way for emergent possibilities. Now, traditional understandings of the prophet carry us into a somewhat enchanted world in which unique or gifted persons offer a glimpse of what is to come in light of our current failings. They dazzle us with the power of their conviction and bind us through public exhortation to a vision of who we ideally are and of what we have tragically become. We do not think of the prophet as a professional of any sort. Theirs is a task rooted in the immediacy of convictions held and the implications of our current doings, not in some routinized practice with its own internal standards of excellence. That would be odd. A guild of prophets would or should warrant immediate suspicion. Prophets profess and exhort with the aim of changing minds and behavior, not with the hopes of demonstrating competence. The prophet speaks, to borrow a phrase from Matthew Arnold, with, quote, fire and strength, end quote, on behalf of someone or something, be it God, nation, or muse. Her authority does not derive from some inner source or from acquired expertise. The fact that she has been chosen has little to do with her innate talents, but instead her authority springs from the outside, from that which carries the force to compel us or those who would listen to act otherwise. Now, of course, this raises serious concern for democratic life, Prophets aren't interested in being convinced otherwise. They are charged to dispense the truth. Their modes of address are typically declarative and imperative, a forceful declaration of the truth that originates elsewhere. In its most recognizable sense, prophets are the central characters in a divinely sanctioned vocation. As Nicholas Wolterstorff puts it, the prophet is one who speaks in the name of God. As a consequence, those who hear the prophet speaking when he is speaking in his prophetic capacity are confronted with that which counts as God speaking. The utterance of God is not something a person just undertakes to do. God will raise up the prophet, and as God raised up Moses. To be a prophet, Wolterstorff continues, requires being deputized to speak in God's name. The prophet is commissioned to communicate a message from God, and God will give that message to the prophet. Now, obviously, this isn't a mode of speech conducive to democratic deliberation or commensurate with the exercise of public reason. As Abraham Joshua Heschel notes, quote, the prophet was the individual who said no to his society, condemning habits and assumptions, its complacency, waywardness, and syncretism, end quote. For some, this passionate way of talking is a conversation stopper. But prophetic speech involves more than forceful declarations, right? It presupposes a background of relations and agreements that make such speech possible. In this sense, the work of the prophet is decidedly social. Her mode of address is always preceded by other words and is a response to extant practices and express values that we call our own. Mutuality adds force and significance to her words. Ideally, in the prophet's company, we come to know and feel something about ourselves and about the arrangements within which we live. In short, the prophet, as Emerson says of great men, is the colorium to clear our eyes so that we might see the vices and follies that block the way to substantive change. The latter part's my words, not Emerson's. And it's in the context of common complaint within community that the prophetic figure can experience the full force of established powers, and that we, as witnesses, attribute to them madness or courage as they continue to enact their charge, irrespective of the consequences. So prophets stand then on the border of the heroic and the heretical. And in each instance, even if a few disagree with their actions, something beautiful is witnessed in their piety and in the virtue of courage exhibited in their willingness to risk. Now, I'm sure Dewey was quite familiar with this view of the prophet. His religious formation in Burlington, Vermont guarantees as much. But to my mind, his use of the word prophetic in individualism in Old and New refers to a different sense of the word, one not so much bound to the charismatic heroic figure who by some magical gift or blessing has insight into the order of things, but instead points us in the direction of inquiry and its centrality to democracy. Walk with me, I'm trying to get somewhere. One way of thinking about Dewey's use of the word is to highlight its predictive function. Just as meteorologists gather data to forecast weather patterns, organisms gather in relevant data in the context of problem solving to envisage outcomes that will affect them for their weal or woe. Some of us work hard to anticipate the hailstorms in our lives, and others do the same with regards to securing happiness. We, in effect, run ahead of the actual experience in order to foresee possible consequences. Do I ask her to marry me or not? Should I take this job out of state or should I stay home? Can we grasp the prospects of freedom even as we suffer the brutal violence of the state? Obviously, such decisions of conduct do not require a special gift of insight or foresight or an unmediated connection with a higher source that commands us to speak on behalf of divinely stated laws. No unified view of reality is required here. We need not be fortune tellers or Weber's charismatic madmen. Instead, this idiosyncratic use of the prophetic seems consonant with the scientific method Dewey commends, in which he entreats us to, quote, attend more fully to the concrete elements entering into the situation in which we have to act, end quote. This view presumes that all is not settled. Matters, especially those that move us about, need tending to. I'm going to come back to this phrase, tending to, in the last lecture on Ella Baker, and often require that we intelligently tinker. That tinkering presupposes an understanding of experience that rejects the atomistic sensationalism of older forms of empiricism for a view of experience that is a matter of our simultaneous doings and sufferings. Experiences are not self-contained events, rather they constitute the field of knowledge acquisition. That is to say, our engagements with environments are experiments in varying the course of events, active attempts that test us in relation to problems faced, the outcome of which are habits that effectively orient us, at least for a moment, to our environments. In the context of our moral lives, such a view urges us to, quote, transfer the weight and burden of morality to intelligence, end quote. Now, prophecy's role in all of this seems to be entailed in the very exercise of the moral imagination. It helps us anticipate and clarify the path ahead in order that we may intelligently redirect, if necessary, those interactions that carry us one way or another. And it is in those moments when unanticipated forces eclipse our habitual ways of living. For example, old notions of individualism that were once liberating, now under different material conditions, constrain individuality and thwart effective freedom. It's under those conditions that we find ourselves in need of prophetic action, conduct reflective of efforts to imagine beyond the opacity of current conditions in order, quote, to grasp undisclosed opportunities and to generate new ideals and ends that further human flourishing. Now, obviously, I'm not suggesting, Brother Tommy, that any decision of conduct constitutes a prophetic act. Clearly, the question, do I marry her, is of a different sort than the question, can I grasp the prospect of freedom in light of my current experience of unfreedom? The difference between the two, among other things, resides in the difference in the scope and force of the questions. One extends beyond the immediacy of those directly involved to include considerations that touch upon the lives of others. It also entails a decision that is unavoidable and the answer to which is momentous. I could easily decide not to ask my love her hand in marriage. She may never know that I even entertained the idea. But the decision to imagine freedom or not is unavoidable. The very fact that I'm faced with the question reveals the complexity of my experience, and whatever I decide to do will profoundly affect the life before me. But to say that not all decisions of conduct are prophetic is not to suggest that such conditions do not inform prophetic action. Each decision in which the imagination is deployed in the exercise of critical intelligence is a dramatic rehearsal for the moment that calls us to the fore. Those intelligent decisions habituate us in such a way that when momentous occasions arise, we are all capable of acting powerfully and decisively. Now, I do not believe that such conduct is characteristic of only unique or special individuals. The view I'm putting forward is not in the mold of Hebrew prophets. Instead, I want to democratize the prophetic, to insist that we all have the capacity to engage in prophecy insofar as we have an occasion in the exercise of critical intelligence to envisage an as yet realized possibility in the context of efforts to secure and expand those ideals that animate our form of life. Behind this, if we can get into Q&A, is a reading of George Herbert Mead's notion of genius. Right? The prophetic within inquiry, then, is not about a commitment to a specific blueprint, but rather it entails a commitment to imagining effective possibilities beyond the limitations experienced. It becomes a key feature of democratic life. Thomas Alexander has it right when he says this: imagination is a phase of activity, right, in which possible activities are envisaged in relation to our situations, thereby amplifying the meaning of the present and creating the context from which present values may be criticized, thus liberating the course of action itself. Imagination is temporally complex in operation in the present, establishing continuity with the past, anticipating the future so that a continuous process of activity may unfold in the most meaningful and value-rich way possible, end quote. Imagination, in its prophetic form, affords us the possible distance necessary to say with fire and strength what is wrong with our current social arrangements and to forecast the emergence of more just arrangements. It is a reflection upon limits and prospects. It can be called to pursue idealized ends and a claim about the animating values of our form of life that may require us to risk everything in their pursuit. In this sense, Dewey stands in a romantic tradition alongside Blake and Coleridge, Emerson, and others. In their hands, the prophet becomes the poet. And in Dewey's hands and my own, the poet is evidenced in the habits of the critical inquirer, not the private ironist, but the inquirer who sees herself in community with others, working to forge a more just world for our children and theirs. In its romantic register, the prophet banks her all on an inability to see beyond the authorities that shape current waves of perceiving, and she stands in relation to the past, not deferentially or as an epigony, but rather to renew the grounds upon which she creates intelligently. This is a crucial point about my pragmatic view of prophecy. The past is not seen as something linear, something that inevitably progresses. Herbert Mead and Benjamin are in the background here, right? Indeed, the novelty of a problem faced often demands a return to the archive to account for its emergence. In other words, the emergent requires a past to lay claim to it. In effect, a history that prophesizes its presence. Think about Walter Benjamin's reading of Schlegel, right? Schlegel's dictum, the historian is a prophet turned backwards, right? Or what Nicholas Noyes says in 1698, prophecy is history antedated, and history is post-dated prophecy, end quote, right? If we identify the prophetic function with the moral imagination in the exercise of critical intelligence, then the past becomes a site for funded experiences that enable us to invade the future with a bit more than luck. Its citation gives shape and contour to present imaginings, as once again a claim is being made upon it. I claim Malcolm X, for example, as I imagine me, and as I engage a fitful world. The challenge, of course, involves not being swallowed whole. We must remember that the problem faced disrupts our habitual ways of doing. The past has been interrupted and occasions the moment of inquiry. The past returns not in the form of a nostalgia for origins, to rest forever in what Harold Bloom calls the primal scene of instruction, but in the work of citation, right? And I'm reminded here of Benjamin's take on Marx's discussion of revolutionary time in the 18th Brumaire. History is the object of a construction, whose site is not the homogeneous and empty time, but time filled by the now. Thus, to Robespierre, ancient Rome has a past charged with the time of the now, which he blasted out of the continuum of history. The French Revolution viewed itself as Rome returned again. It cited ancient Rome the way fashion cites costumes of the past, unquote. The claim of the past, its invocation in the context of prophetic speech, is not to swallow whole an as yet realized present. Instead, its voicing, our attempt to redeem it, interrupts current uses of the past in the justification of the order of things. Again, prophecy isn't simply about prediction. Prophecy, quote, is a call and claim, as Ian Balfour says, a call oriented toward a present that is not present. Now, oh, Lord, I'm running out of time. Mine is not a concern with debunking the legacies of Plato. The problem here is not one of error or ignorance, nor am I committing Shelley's mistake of trading the deification of reason for the deification of imagination. Richard Rorty has it right when he urged us, quote, to think of imagination not as a faculty that generates mental images, but as the ability to change social practices, end quote. In light of that view, my aim is to open up, and this has been kind of dense, and you'll have to read it when the book comes out, right? My aim is to open up a particular avenue of inquiry, which enables an expansion of the pragmatist tradition by making prophecy an important category of analysis. I also want to rethink the prophetic function within African American intellectual history. A certain understanding of the prophetic undermines democratic energies as individuals invest their capacities in and relinquish their imaginations to someone who has been called. Prophetic voices are all too often thought to be unique individuals, typically male, with special callings that distinguish them from us. And such a view has been an interesting and, I believe, has had a problematic impact on the form and content of African American democratic politics. Now, obviously, my thinking about pragmatism and prophecy is indebted to Cornel West's view of prophetic pragmatism and the American evasion of philosophy. In some ways, this is a patricidal act. But West's prophetic pragmatism is a bit too dependent upon biblical prophecy and the unified view of reality that practice presupposes. West understands prophetic pragmatism as a form of inquiry in the context of human efforts to preserve and expand empathy and compassion in light of those operations of power that frustrate human flourishing. His is an effort to make more explicit an encounter between the abiding faith among pragmatists in the capacities of everyday ordinary people and those structural forces that constrain and limit their ability to act in the world. As such, prophetic pragmatism consists in a series of supplements, not Derridian supplements, but, what's that health store? The health stuff where you can go buy GMC supplements, right? So as such, prophetic pragmatism consists in a series of supplements aiming at building a more robust and, by extension, more effective form of pragmatism as cultural critique. West turns to Marxism, Christianity, Foucault's genealogical approach, tragedy, Chekhovian compassion, the African American prophetic tradition, because on his view, a lack of something remains at the heart of this American philosophical tradition. He accuses pragmatism of a certain kind of intellectual anemia. And the adjective prophetic constitutes the shorthand for each of his supplemental moves. But supplements can distort and disfigure, so much so that in some instances the noun is no longer recognizable. In his review of the American evasion of philosophy, Rorty wrote that, quote, the basic tension in American evasion is between a wish to evade philosophy and a hope that philosophy will be a powerful instrument of social change. This tension can also be thought of as that between the pragmatist as professor and as prophet, the pragmatist as cleaning up rubbish left over from the past, and the pragmatist as the dreamer who first glimpses the concrete outlines of a better future. That was actually published in Transitions. He goes on to say that if one assumes the professorial view of pragmatism as having some true significance beyond our narrow professional concerns, then the term prophetic pragmatism will sound as odd as charismatic trash disposal. As insightful and as funny as this criticism is, it actually reveals a central problem with West and Rorty's view of Deweyan pragmatism. Neither foregrounds the significance of inquiry in their accounts. Instead, we're left with redescription, Rorty's linguistic turn, which turns him away from Dewey's experimentalism, and West's prophetic bricolage, what I want to call his strategy of supplement. And although West describes prophetic pragmatism as a form of inquiry, he says little, if anything, about what that might mean in its details. But if we take seriously Dewey's insistence on inquiry and its relation to democratic life, we leave behind the sort of tension Rorty identifies in West between professor and prophet, precisely because we can locate the prophetic in the very exercise of critical intelligence, something we all can, with education, do. Here, Hillary Putnam has it right. What we pragmatists have in common is the conviction that the solution to the loss of the world problem is to be found in action and not in metaphysics, and that democratically conducted inquiry is to be trusted in this effort, not because it is infallible, but because the way in which we will find out where and how our procedures need to be revised is through the process of inquiry itself. This process, and I will take this up in more detail in the third lecture on Ella Baker, involves the imagination as we grapple with what is before us in light of what could be. And when matters of justice are involved, inquiry becomes the occasion for the prophetic act. The place of prophecy resolves itself then into a practical consideration of the conduct of life. How might prophecy work in the moral lives of individuals, in their efforts to make claims about the character of the whole, the consequences of conduct, the conditions of flourishing, and in their capacity to see the actual in light of the possible? Right? After all, Dewey understood democracy as a personal way of individual life, that it signifies the possession and continual use of certain attitudes, forming personal character and determining desire and purpose in all the relations of life. How might a democratized conception of the prophetic, I got 10 minutes, work in light of this vision, especially in the context of a subject people for whom the prophetic function is central to their political imaginings? I want to turn to Dr. King for a quick second in the last bit of this talk. I've been abusing your patience, I'm sorry, especially for someone who says he's so democratic. To study Dr. King's life is to confront the tragic realities of our nation's racial past and present. It is to encounter intimately the wounds that shadow our current practices. King was indeed a prophetic witness. Standard accounts of his career divide that witness into two major periods. The first begins with Montgomery boycott in 55 and ends with the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama in 65. The second, of course, from Selma to his murder in 68 in Memphis. Throughout his public life, whether he graced the cover of Time magazine or as one of the most despised men in the nation, King's vision was grounded in the dissenting tradition of America, that tradition of public exhortation that joined social criticism to moral renewal, calling America back to its founding ideals of democracy, freedom, and equality. So King stands in a rhetorical tradition of the American Jeremiah, which goes all the way back to Winthrop's famous sermon in 1630. But with a difference. His was an American Jeremiah transformed by the prophetic black church tradition. So obviously King's imagination was nurtured in the black church. He was a child of preachers. His father and grandfather were not simply Baptist ministers, but ministers who saw the significance of churches to the social, economic, and political realities that affected the daily lives of black folk. What Claiborne Caution calls an African-American version of the social gospel. Given this backdrop, King likened the struggle for civil rights as one for the soul of America. His was a moral as well as political concern. Now, of course, he had his moments of doubt. You know this, right? In Strength of Love, he said, cried out, "I'm here taking a stand for what I believe is right, but now I'm afraid I'm at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to a point where I can't face it alone." And here he stands on the brink of despair, trying very much to hold off what Du Bois called the temptation of doubt. So at this moment, King heard a quiet assurance of an inner voice telling him to stand up for righteousness and to stand up for truth. God will be at your side forever. Now, this response registers one of the powerful dimensions of religious faith, that it bolsters our imaginations to see beyond the limit conditions of the actual world we inhabit. Indeed, for a black Christian like King, God's assurance transforms his relation to the world and his relation to himself. King grasps who he is in terms of the vastness that is opened up by and through his imagination. He understands his doings as directed towards something beyond where he currently stands. And that reorients him to the moment, emboldening him, as it were, to act. Faith then can be understood as a tendency toward action and imagination as its central conduit. One clearly sees this at work in the religious tradition out of which King comes. African American slaves who convert to Christianity found themselves locked in a brutal relation of domination, and their relation to God enables them to see beyond the opacity of their own condition, imagining the possible as they endure the absurdity of the actual. Religious imagination occasions then the possibility of what Robin Kelly so brilliantly calls freedom dreams, black utopian imaginings, which characterize so much of African American strivings. In 1957, I'm going to come home, I'm sorry to abuse you. In 1957, King spoke of the challenges of a new age, and here we see clearly his invocation of freedom dreams. No matter the difficulty of the hour, King knew that the foundations of American apartheid had been shaken as former slaves began to understand themselves as true agents of change and as children of God. In fact, he stated that Americans of all colors stood between two worlds, a dying world and an emerging new, and the ever-present nature of the present stood only as a dramatic rehearsal for a new world desperately trying to come into being. Drawing on Emerson, King encouraged his congregation to confront their fears, for, quote, he has not learned the lesson of life who does not every day surmount fear, end quote. King dared, even under the most horrible of conditions, to imagine a better world. And imagination here is not some adolescent fantasy, right? The imagination, again, is that moral faculty which allows us to spy the dim outlines of a possible future, unharnessed from the problems of now. The imagination enables us to muster the courage to proceed in pursuit of conditions that are not readily seen. It is the conduit for a faith that encourages and emboldens us to run ahead of the evidence, what William James described as that readiness to act in a cause, the prosperous issue of which is not certified in advance. But this view of imagination can be thought of apart from one's relation to God. Indeed, King's prophetic insistence in 1957, in the context of Emmett Till's murder, the independence of Ghana, the practice of interposition and nullification, lends itself to a reading not so much rooted in any particular religious tradition, even as we note his obvious Christian commitments, precisely because of the overt political, constitutional, and democratic terms with which he prophesied. To understand King solely in moral terms is to render him, following Arendt, unpolitical, in that it would suggest that his primary interests rest elsewhere, beyond this world where the wrongs have actually been committed. Reading his use of prophecy in this way opens up how we might think of his role as an exemplar of virtuous action and democratic energies, as well as challenge the model of leadership he often exemplifies. We turn our attention away from the glare of the so-called prophet before us to the delicate task of tending to the prophetic that lies within all of us. On this reading, King would no longer cast such a shadow over us, or minimally over me, a kind of moral giant under which we cower. Instead, he exemplifies what resides in each of us, the power to unsettle the present by insisting on the open-ended character of the future. Now I'm going to skip to the end because obviously I've written. I don't want to abuse you guys. There's a whole reading here of King. Part of what I'm trying to do here is to read King in a romantic register, right? What I've done in the first section of the lecture, right, is to try to suggest that if we read Dewey in a romantic register, suddenly the prophet or prophetic gets located in what he understands to be the work of critical intelligence. And critical intelligence is absolutely key to what he takes to be the work of Reconstruction. So Dewey says, in effect, that there's a bad question at the heart of the Western philosophical tradition. And what he wants to do is to redirect our energies, to bridge the divide between practice and theory, right? In order to get us to orient ourselves to problems. Because remember, critical intelligence is moving from a problematic situation to a more determinately resolved situation, right? So part of what I've done is locate prophecy within the context of critical intelligence, that ability to look beyond the immediacy of now to envision what is possible, right? This is a kind of play on Charles Long's rendering of what slaves did in the context of slavery, right? To look beyond the opacity of one's condition, right? And that's not locatable in someone who exhibits, right, anointing. That's not reducible to someone who somehow has been authorized by a voice outside of us, by an authority outside of us. Rather, it's located in all of us. Now, what I wanted to suggest is that there's a way of reading Dr. King, right, given the political arc of his witness, right, in this register, understanding that his Christian commitments are absolutely crucial to his self-identity. But there are these moments throughout his public witness where he's urging everyday ordinary people to utilize their imaginations, to dream beyond the moment in which they find themselves, right? And what I want to say is that when we read King in this register, he comes down to us, right? He comes down to us. The price of change. Now, I don't want to read that sentence. In his last sermon on March 31st, 1968, at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., King took as his text a passage from the book of Revelation. Behold, I make all things new, former things have passed away. As he stood on death's doorstep, his imagination worked to see beyond the moment. King understood that some of us were sleepwalking, right? To harken back to Thoreau. And he offered a lesson in remaining awake through a great revolution. Now, much work needed to be done. Racism, poverty, and militarism threatened the soul of the nation. King's prophetic voice called us to attention, and he offered us through his words and deeds an opportunity to imagine for ourselves a more just and loving world. King's words and witness urge us to see ourselves as Dewey would, and David Bromwich as well, as both doer and object, who asks, quote, what a given act is doing to himself and to his neighbors. And in doing so, we become less prey to an imagination heated by proselytism and war, end quote. And King exemplified the claim in his sacrifice that democracy is a way of life predicated on a working faith in the possibilities of who we can become. Now, none of what I've said dismisses the depth of King's religious convictions and how those convictions set his imagination on fire. What I'm trying to do in the part that I skipped is to kind of read a kind of democratic perfectionism at the heart of King's project, and we can talk a lot about that. The belief that the outcome of the future is settled beforehand animated much of King's public ministry, even as he urged Americans to become co-participants in that future's realization. My purpose has been to disentangle the prophetic function from the certainty of King's religious worldview, and in doing so, to bring King back down to us. I also hoped, in the parts that you didn't hear, to scale down our utopian musings so that we may see them as idealizations that spur us to act without evidence of guaranteed success, where the spell of chosen people with the truth in their hands is broken. No prophets descending from mountaintops anymore. Rather, bearing witness to the multitudes of prophetic acts becomes our task. Bearing witness to the multitudes of prophetic acts, striking the blow for effective freedom in the face of neoliberalism's insistence that we all become like sacks and stomachs. And that's the end of the talk. I was told by all who love me that it was too long. And they were right.
Questions, comments? We'll pass the mic and I will start. Thank you. Eddie,
Yes, sir.
What happens when your prophetic clashes with my prophetic? Since I take it that you say the prophetic is socially constructed, it's not divine revelation, as you point out, anymore, right?
Right.
So what happens when...
It's worked out in the context of debate and deliberation. My task is not to determine what constitutes the good prophet and the bad prophet, right? It's thrown into experience. And what has to happen is that you put forward your vision and I put forward mine. And this is not just simply a deliberative exercise, right? So this is not a kind of Rawlsian, Rawls worries about a certain kind of perfectionism, right? This is more Cavelian, right? And Rawls's worry about perfectionism is that precisely the way in which I put forward a particular self-conception of individuality in which we could generate visions of a future, it actually shuts out other visions. No, this is completely individualized. That gets worked out in the debate, in the back and forth of actual, and the messiness, to use Beckett's language, of political life.
And second, before we open it up, can one profess and be prophetic? Can one profess within these hallowed walls and still be
oh.
prophetic in the way that you, or does it require action outside of the
No,
academy?
absolutely. The short answer is yes. Because what I've done is, if what I'm doing is compelling, is to suggest that insofar as insofar as we all have the capacity to exercise critical intelligence, where moral imagination, right, is deployed in an effort to envision a future that is not yet realized, we can engage in a prophetic act, especially when matters of justice are at stake. So it's all of us.
I was hoping you would. PJ, then Tommy?
Thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Is King an instantiation of the prophetic tradition or its ultimate? Because, I'm wondering if your great need to democratize the prophetic function is mindful of the fact that prophecy continues regardless, and that the great need to demystify prophecy attaches to a particularly very powerful instantiation of that tradition, which perhaps ends with King. I don't know.
Right.
I'm thinking of Jeremy Wright. So is it that your project is really attached to an extraordinarily powerful instantiation of this tradition, which is pervaded by a whole range of
Right.
not so
Right.
get what I mean?
Yeah, this is a brilliant question. Remember, what's the motivation the motivation of the talk, or the motivation of what will be the book? And the motivation is that there are certain ways of orienting oneself to the political process within black communities that I want to suggest deform democratic life in black communities, right? And one of the ways in which democratic individuality, black democratic individuality is deformed, right, is by way of a certain understanding of the prophetic or the prophet or the hero, right? And part of, and you can see those of you who might have Ella Baker in view, you can see why she ends up as, quote unquote, the hero of the talk, right? Because there's a deep suspicion, right, in the very ways in which she organized, right, of a certain kind of leadership, black leader, a certain version of black leadership, right? And this worry actually extends into the context of the context that shaped the formation of, say, Ralph Ellison and others, right? There's a whole body of literature that emerges in the 30s and 40s, in the 40s in particular, really trying to understand the great figure, right? Coming off the heels of the significance of Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and FDR and Churchill, right? There are ways in which people are really thinking about, well, how do great men impact, right, public life, right? And this translates in African-American tradition of letters in very interesting ways. John Wright has a wonderful chapter of this in his book, Shadowing Ellison, where he talks about the conscious hero and how this informs Ellison's view. So that's a real serious aside. But the point is pretty straightforward. What's motivating the account, King is in fact this distorted understanding of prophecy that overdetermines how, I believe, how African Americans enter into the democratic process, engage in the democratic process, right? Where we in some ways abdicate our responsibilities to those who represent us. And a kind of Bolinian suspicion of representation in its relation to democratic life pervades the entire talk.
Great lecture.
Thanks.
Interesting and rich. And as you know, I'm very sympathetic to the direction you want to take things. But look, I guess I have a question about the limits of how far you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
So two questions, I guess. One, I'm wondering about the scope of the prophetic. I mean, you might think that it extends to moral reasoning and moral judgment about, thinking about what a just society would look like, thinking about what the good society would look like, or even a decent one. So that it's about, and so there, when we're thinking about moral questions, there are no experts, as it were.
Right.
There's no one you can defer to or all equals with respect to that. Not to say that there aren't some people with more moral insight, or some people who have thought more about a question, but there are no experts, as it were. Right? But if you thought that the prophetic also extends to a diagnosis of how we got where we are, what are the causes of our problems, especially as the stuff from Wendy Brown about neoliberalism and thinking about what that means, you might think there it's harder to have the same as it were faith in ordinary people to understand those forces. To understand those kinds of forces requires skill and training. So you might wonder whether. So the first part is do you think that the prophetic extends to social diagnosis and explanation, or only to moral reasoning, moral judgment? And then the second part is about, is there space within the perfectionist vision for, if you like, the intelligentsia or for experts?
Absolutely.
And where and how, might they figure in such a picture? Because it looks like there's going to need to be some, if you like, epistemic deference to their judgment about causes and about what will work and about what's feasible, whereas you wouldn't have such deference about what's right and what's just and what's good.
Right. That's a great question, Tommy. I expected it from you. Well, I mean, with regards to the first part, given my Deweyan commitments, you can understand that it's very difficult to kind of separate the exercise of moral reasoning from kind of historical context or contextualizing and a kind of thick description of the problem faced. So there's a way in which we encounter a problem that disrupts our particular habitual way of acting. Dewey would say we have to engage in a kind of prognosis. That prognosis may involve an assessment of how we arrived at the problem, i.e. Wendy Brown's account. It may involve a series of its potential effects as we kind of engage in dramatic rehearsal. That is to say, imagine, what if we do this, what if we do that? So he wants to say that within the context of the exercise of critical intelligence in facing a particular problem, we engage in a kind of wide kind of work in order to understand the problem so that we can invade or address with a little bit more than luck, right? And he says that we all can acquire that capacity if we're cultivated in particular sorts of ways. This is why education becomes such a crucial component to Dewey's democratic theory, right? So democracy and education, Dewey says, if you want to see a system, go read that book, right? So democracy and education is absolutely crucial. And I kind of align his emphasis on education with the ways in which Septima Clark and Ella Baker emphasized freedom schools and Bob Moses and SNCC organized these schools, right, in order to equip people, right, with the means, right, to become, right, who they're capable of being, right? And equip might be a bit strong, but the idea is to put in place, right, a way of organizing, to engage in a process, a method, a way of organizing that doesn't lead them to defer to the person, but rather cultivates a practice of receptivity. I'm getting ahead of myself, right? A politics of tending that Roland would suggest, right? That will open up possibility, right? For them exercising the kind of thing that we want to attribute to experts, right? So part of what I want to suggest is that experts play a role, right? But their expertise is in relation to the kinds of problems that people face. And to the extent to which their expertise is disconnected from that, right? Then they become Lippmann-like folk, right? Schumpeter-like folk, right? And then you're dealing with a sort of problem that contemporary political theorists worry about, that everyday ordinary people just simply don't have the means or the capacity to do the work that democracy demands. And so we have to outsource it to those experts who actually have the capacity to do so, right? Now, Dewey rejects that explicitly in Public and Its Problems, and I want to suggest that the organizing of SNCC and the organizing of Ella Baker rejects it. That is to say, expertise actually works within the context of problems faced. where deferral takes place, but only in light of a process or a method that is actually extending the possibility for the exercise of the capacities and responsibilities that democracy demands, right? So let me say that more simply. To the extent to which expertise denies the person engaged, right, their responsibility to act on behalf of democracy, expertise is actually at that point dangerous, right? So we have to emphasize a method, a process, whereby expertise enters into the arena as a way to enable others to acquire it, right? Or to enable others to grasp it, right? If it's going to work in a democratic way. That's not satisfying, but it's the way in which I'm beginning to parse that problem I'm thinking about. Oh, he does all that.
Thanks very much for that deep overview. And I'm going to sort of, maybe I'm an elitist, or maybe I'm sort of just historical, but when I look over history in terms of the prophetic, I do think that there are certain epochs when events throw out, you know, David Walker's appeal didn't come from anyone. It came from David Walker. Okay?
I'm with you on that one.
A man like Martin Luther King, he was the man for that epoch. And there is, in my view, there are people who are gifted and who has not only the charisma, the everything just comes together. So it's good to democratize, the prophetic. But I think if we look through history, Moses didn't come out of anywhere. You look to all the historical epochs when major transformation, disjuncture took place. And that prophetic, that you could call it charisma, you could call it leadership, whatever, but you're looking at the prophetic. I'm a bit concerned then,
Right.
because I think today if we had the prophetic, like a Malcolm X, that things would be going differently. So I think that...
That's precisely what I'm worried about.
Yeah,
right there. That formulation is what
yes.
worries me.
So, but I'm just saying that you have to now, you haven't convinced me.
Okay, watch this.
So far.
Watch this. Eddie Long, watch this.
That the prophetic could be democratized.
But so the worry is that the very ways in which I'm thinking about the prophetic levels completely, right? That is, obviously it's a leveling project. I mean, I granted that in the beginning, right? And so the idea is that, right, Eddie, if we take you at your word, then what room is there for the prophet or genius? Right? So there's a footnote that I didn't read. It's a long footnote. I've been long-winded, but it's from George Herbert Mead. And I want to read this right quick. George Herbert Mead's view of social genius comes to mind as a response. Mead argued that each of us has the capacity to make the communities within which we live different through the actions we take to secure and expand the ideals that animate our communal life. Hold on. It is here that we see the differentiation, Mead writes, between the I and me. But it is also here that we encounter genius, those persons with an incalculable quality who, quote, carry to the nth power this change in the community by the individual who makes himself a part of it, who belongs to it, end quote. Their efforts, Mead goes on to write, make the society a noticeably different society. But Mead goes on to say, to the degree, quote, this is my response, to the degree that we make the community in which we live different, we all have what is essential to genius, and which becomes genius when the effects are profound. So what King demonstrates, right, is what's in us, right? What Malcolm exhibited, it's what's in us. But this is precisely, I'm going to talk about this in the next lecture, this is precisely Emerson's engagement with Montaigne. This is Emerson's response to Goethe. This is Emerson's response to Swedenborg. This is what he does in Representative Men, right? These great people, right, exhibit qualities that ought not to make us cower, because every time you encounter greatness, Emerson writes, you risk self-loss. But great people, according to Emerson, make even greater people possible. That's where I'm trying to get. I'm not trying to deny genius. I'm not trying to deny that people stand out.
I'm thinking about the mobilizing point, the point when everything like fire erupts.
Right.
That's what makes substantial change. That's what makes radical change. When you have that leader coming up and from nowhere, you say, oh my gosh, what God? And then you have 100
So-
years later, people are analyzing.
So,
That's what it affects.
so King came from nowhere? Alden Morris's work on the origins of the civil rights movement? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to ask,
Yeah, it is.
I want to ask a question because I think it's related to this. And
I like
I
this.
say this too long, but so King did not arise from nowhere,
Mm-hmm.
but he arose out of a group of people who were already doing things.
Absolutely.
So he arose out of a movement that these women in Montgomery had already had blueprints.
Absolutely.
So here's my question to you, and I'm going to start with a Bible verse, so obviously that's the moral meaning to it. It's the verse that says, where there is no vision, the
People will perish.
Now, I want to say that to you because it seems to me, as I listen to you, there is a difference between the prophetic and the vision. And it seems that the prophetic is something that must arise out of the visionary. But the people, if you think about the people perish, that is a kind of democratized understanding of what you're talking about. It is to me a prophetic democratic. You know, the liberal prophetic, where people are visionary. But from those people emerged something that is genius. And that genius is the prophetic.
Yeah, but they didn't create change.
That's my point. You don't create him. He is part of that visionary people. Those people in Montgomery were already visionary. Rosa Parks was already
But
visionary.
they prepared the ground.
Exactly, but this is my point.
They couldn't even have imagined
He
Martin Luther King.
arise. Martin Luther King could not have imagined it. Right. So Martin Luther King emerges out of this amazing moment of
Right.
visionary people
Right,
who preceded him,
right,
already had this boycott plan before he even got in. He just
Right.
got pulled into it.
right.
And in that moment, there was something about him that was the genius that comes out of it.
But that's what Linda was suggesting
No,
about.
that is what I'm saying, but what
About
I'm
this
saying in
eruption
defense
happened.
of, but what I'm saying in defense of both of them, I think I'm saying, is that what you are describing as this prophetic that you want to see in everybody, I think I would call the visionary. We want everybody to be visionary. We want people to see beyond, or the people perish. However, this person, the prophetic, that's something special. That's something that comes out.
But see, this is,
And wait a minute, and there are lots of prophetic people.
right, but this is my worry though. Remember, what's the worry?
How did the visionary perceive?
No, but this is the worry. My worry is that that prophetic figure can in fact distort
The visionary?
democratic life.
I don't think so. I think
Oh,
the-
absolutely. I will bank my all on that whenever.
Let me just say, if you look at Montgomery, if you even look at the SNCC people, they came into communities. They didn't deliver to Fannie Lou Hamer.
Right.
Fannie Lou Hamer and those people in the Black Belt worked with them.
Right.
They
So we're not
had vision.
we're not disagreeing on that point.
So what I'm saying, when you have somebody like a Fannie Lou Hamer,
Right.
who rises up out of that as this voice. and
But
there's a lot of those people down there.
Right. And part of the beauty, I don't want to get it
So what I'm saying is her voice doesn't
squash. Right.
See, her voice just gives it more momentum. But what I'm saying is what I'm saying to you is a fundamental thing. I think the visionary has to be there for the prophetic to emerge. That's all.
Okay. All right. I know we got some more folks. We got.
Okay, so Eddie, thank you first for a wonderful talk, and it certainly made me think a lot. My question actually follows the previous two, but from a different angle. So let's assume that we can democratize the prophetic voice in the way that you described. I wonder whether it is necessary to your project to use King in the way that you did.
No.
And this, I think, might explain some of the tensions here. So what I mean by this, so on one hand, you could have done it the way you did it, and I'm sure you're going to tell me the reason. Two, you could have said that actually King's, the way in which King embodied the prophetic, in fact, limits or inhibits this democratized view of the prophetic voice that you are urging.
Right.
And because he's constrained in certain sorts of ways by his religious commitments, it was remarkably effective, but the world in which you imagine where there is prophetic, democratized prophetic voices are inhibited by that sort of figure. Or you could have talked about it in the way, could have talked about King in the way that you just used Emerson with Representative Men. You could have said, this is what King was, but we might better understand him in this way now. So the question is, you, in your project, at least from what I heard, you were suggesting that there were aspects of King that urged this democratized view.
Absolutely.
And we could quibble back and forth with that, but I wonder what work that read of King
Right.
does
I get it.
ultimately.
That's
Yeah.
a great question. It's a great question. Remember, the motivation for the project is what I take to be a distortion in African American political life, right? A distortion in African American political life, right? And what I want to suggest is that what I'm suggesting in my reading of King, and it's a strong Bloomian read, right? Right? It's a strong reading in Harold Bloom's sense of strong reading, right? And let me just make it very clear: the three people who are at the center of all three talks, are people that are crucial to my own self-formation, right? Because the arc of the talk is actually rooted in my commending the work of self-creation through my own effort, right? And you'll see this tomorrow explicitly, right? I'll make this explicit because what I believe in King, there are these moments in which you could read King where you see what I take to be a democratic perfectionist sensibility, right? That King is urging us, and although you can read it in a religious register, and in fact, it's consistent to read him in that register. But I wanted to read him in a romantic register, that King is actually urging us to reach for a higher self. And as we reach for that higher self, we're leaving a self behind, right? And this becomes, for me, a very radical gesture, because the logic of white supremacy is to collapse black individuality into a kind of indistinguishable sameness, which deforms how we engage in the political process, because it necessitates the representation of collective interest. It necessitates channeling our interest into someone who brokers for us to other people. And what I love about, remember, I'm getting to that last lecture about Baker, she's suspicious of that kind of politics because it actually, right, A, denies the capacities and responsibilities of everyday ordinary people, right? It actually betrays the perfectionist strand and the radical work that it's doing in black political life. This is not an individualism that's reducible to Herman Cain's insistence that black people be, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a robust conception of democratic individuality where black people can escape, right, the totalizing effects of a certain kind of white supremacist gaze that generates a certain kind of politics. And behind this, of course, is Adolph Reed's complex story, right, of post-segregation black politics, right? Right? So King becomes, for me, a crucial point of entry because what resides there, right, is elements of a perfectionist strand that I'm going to make explicit in Baker. First, two, King's role, because the new orthodoxy, I said the orthodoxy, bless you, the orthodoxy post-1980 is that King becomes what? The representative figure for the civil rights movement as such. And with the memorial now, we have the holiday now with the memorial, it eclipses the complexity on the ground that Evelyn just laid out, right? And distorts in interesting sorts of ways how political interest, how political the political complexity of our communities, such that Jesse will try, I'm getting ahead of myself, Jesse will try to assume the reign of the black leader. Jesse fails 84, 88, Sharpton tries to run in there, right? And now we have the ultimate example of that form of politics in the White House, right? Distorting black democratic life in interesting sorts of ways, right? I can't defend that claim yet, but I'm getting there. So King becomes this important figure because I think he's doing a lot of work symbolically and substantively. There's a lot there that opens up because the political arc of his argument actually allows me to read him in this register if Arendt is right. Right? Otherwise, he's just a moralist.
We have time for one more question. I'm sorry, I already called.
Oh,
Doris, if you can ask your question during the reception. Doris,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
come back.
and then can we get Bob Moses?
Does he have a question?
Yeah, after Darcy. No, come on. No, please.
concede.
No, you're not conceding.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I just said you're not conceding.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk and for this discussion. And I want to just see if I can paraphrase some of your remarks by emphasizing the importance of education for democracy, right? Because if you have an educated base of people, you don't have a leader taking over as a demagogue, but as really a spokesperson for a voice that's collected from individuals. Okay, so for that reason, I am curious about whether your reading of Dewey extends to, refers to his emphasis on arts for education. Because, you know, we can debate whether prophecy is something that is the stuff of genius or an innate disposition. But the disposition towards making art, in Dewey's opinion, and here he's taking from Schiller, there's your romantic tendency, is deep, it's hardwired, and it seems to me an important element to revive in Dewey's proposals, because in the creation of art, African Americans have shown vision beyond what exists in ways that continue to surprise the general public and to refresh the discourse in lots of ways. And it's also an area that is so endangered, so beleaguered, so underfunded, because we haven't taken it seriously as a foundation for democratic development, that it makes sense, at least for me, to refresh that part of Dewey's proposal.
I would agree. My hesitancy in the course of this particular project is that I did not want to be accused of aestheticizing black politics. So just as the response to Ellison's project is that he aestheticizes it, right? There's a certain response to certain readings of Arendt, right? I did not want that argument or counter to arise. So I kind of bracketed it. And in my work on Dewey, I tend to bracket art as experience, right? I really don't. The central text for me is actually Quest for Certainty and Public and Its Problems and Democracy and Education. But that's not to say that your point is not right on point.
Final question for Bob Moses. Can you give me the microphone? 1 second.
Absolutely.
Bob Moses knows quite a lot about the prophetic himself.
Hello, everybody.
It's not on?
So I'd like to, it's actually not a question. I'd like to talk a little about some of the history that people raised in their questions. And so Fannie Lou Hamer came about because the people in SNCC took what Ella had done for them and did it for the sharecroppers in Mississippi. So what had Ella done for SNCC? SNCC was the manifestation of the sit-in movement. So what Ella did for the sit-in movement was create a space so that the leadership of the sit-in movement could be its own thing. And so that was SNCC. And so when SNCC went into Mississippi, it had somehow assimilated that idea, and it did that for sharecroppers in Mississippi. It helped them create something that SNCC was not going to be the leader of, right? And Fannie Lou Hamer arose out of that. In fact, I was on the bus when she first arose, because Amzie Moore had arranged for a school bus to take sharecroppers from Louisville down to Indianola to register to vote. And I was sitting on that bus. And so there was this one lady, from the time the bus started until it ended, sang every church song that had ever been sung in any black church. And what she did was she drove away the fear of all the women on the bus, right? So whatever people are talking about, Fannie Lou Hamer had some of that, right? What SNCC and the movement did was allow that to get expressed nationally, right? And so it happened at the Democratic Convention, right, 1964. So I want to talk about that. So I'm in a room. Fannie Lou Hamer's in the room. Martin Luther King is in the room. Right? Bayard Rustin is in the room. Hubert Humphrey's in the room. Walter Reuther's in the room. Right? Bayard Rustin, Walter Reuther, Hubert Humphrey have been sent to tell King what he must do around the challenge of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Right? Mrs. Hamer is taking the stand that Jim Crow politics is wrong and you don't have a right to do wrong. King is taking the stand that you can't bring morality into politics. Politics has its own way of dealing with these things, right? And if you look at what happened in this country, right, it was King's version of that. Bayard Rustin wrote that article right afterwards. And that's what we got. We didn't get Fannie Lou Hamer out of that. And in fact, the voice of Fannie Lou Hamer was squelched, right? And what came out of that was these people over here, they don't understand politics, right? And they don't understand this country, and they need to be crushed, right? And the liberals came to Mississippi to crush them, right?
Ladies and gentlemen,